Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome to another deep dive. We're tackling a pretty big topic this time, César Chávez and the United Farm Workers.
Oh, yeah, a big one for sure.
And, we got all sorts of stuff to dig into. We've got like the standard histories, some academic papers, and even a few primary sources.
Ooh, primary sources, always my favorite.
I know, right?
Yeah.
Like we've got this old-time magazine cover, some original UFW campaign materials, pretty cool stuff. Should give us a good look into, a pivotal moment, really, in American history.
I think a lot of people, when they hear César Chávez, they just think, grapes and lettuce.
Yeah, for sure.
But it goes so much deeper than that. You're talking about a whole community that had basically been ignored, marginalized for a long, long time. And Chavez and the UFW, they were fighting for dignity, for a voice, for, basic human rights.
Right. And I think for a lot of folks, the image that comes to mind is that iconic Time magazine cover.
Oh, absolutely.
Chavez front and center, this almost saint-like figure. People compared him to Dr. King, the whole champion of nonviolent resistance.
You can't overstate how important that Time cover was. It came out on July 4th, which, talk about symbolism.
Oh, yeah.
It put Chavez right up there with all the other big names in the civil rights movement. And the comparisons to Dr. King, they make a lot of sense when you dig a little deeper.
Oh, yeah.
Both men were deeply religious, both knew how to mobilize the church, and both were totally committed to nonviolence.
Yeah.
That really resonated with Mexican Americans, especially at a time when, like I said, they were really struggling to be heard, to be seen as equals.
I guess when you have that sort of heroic image, though, it kind of makes you wonder if other people's contributions get, lost in the shuffle a bit.
That's a good point. I mean, Chavez was undoubtedly a charismatic leader.
Oh, for sure.
But the UFW's success, it was really a team effort. Take Dolores Huerta, for example. People don't talk about her enough, but she was absolutely vital to the movement. She helped come up with a lot of their strategies, and she was tireless in advocating for farm workers' rights. Her story and so many others, they add a whole other layer to our understanding of the UFW.
Okay, so let's dig into the UFW itself. How did it even come about? What were some of their biggest wins? And I guess, how did they end up changing the whole landscape of farm labor in America?
So the United Farm Workers, as we know it today, it was actually formed by merging two groups. The National Farm Workers Association, which Chavez founded in 1962, and the Agricultural Workers Organizing Committee.
Huh.
Combining those two, it really gave them the power to make a difference.
Makes sense.
And their biggest early win has got to be the Delano Grape Strike.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that one.
It lasted 5 years, from 1965 to 1970, and it was about so much more than just wages or working conditions. It was like a masterclass in nonviolent resistance, really.
Okay, you said masterclass. What made this strike so different from other labor movements at the time?
Well, they were really smart about using consumer boycotts. They got millions of people across the country to stop buying grapes, and that put a ton of pressure on the growers.
Ah, so it wasn't just about the workers themselves, it was about getting the public involved.
Exactly. And it worked. The growers ended up having to recognize the union, and they agreed to contracts that gave the workers better pay and better conditions.
Wow, that's incredible. But was that kind of victory, was it something they could actually keep up long term? Were there things that, maybe undermined its impact over time?
Yeah, that's a great question, because while the Delano Grape Strike was a huge turning point, the UFW's journey, it was full of challenges. We'll get into those a bit later, but you'll see how things like the economy changing, political stuff, and even, tension within the movement itself all played a part.
Okay, so we've got to talk about the California Agricultural Labor Relations Act of 1975.
Oh, yeah, a landmark moment.
It seems like a huge win for the UFW, right?
Absolutely. It was groundbreaking. This law guaranteed that farm workers had the right to unionize, to bargain collectively. It was really a testament to all the work the UFW had done, the public support they had rallied. The tricky part was actually enforcing those rights, because the growers, they weren't going down without a fight.
So even with the law on their side, it wasn't over.
Not even close. The growers had a lot of power money, political connections, you name it.
Yeah.
They looked for any way to get around the new laws. Loopholes, intimidation tactics, even relying on undocumented workers, people who were desperate for work and scared of being deported.
Wow.
It really made it hard for the UFW to organize effectively. It was like, David versus Goliath, and Goliath had a lot of advantages. But before we get too deep into the challenges, You mentioned earlier that the UFW's legacy, it wasn't just about labor rights.
Right, right. What did you mean by that?
Well, one of the things people don't always realize is that the UFW was like a training ground for future leaders and activists.
Oh, interesting.
All the skills they learned during those campaigns, organizing, strategizing, building community well, it gave people the tools to go out and make a difference in all sorts of social justice movements all across the country. You could almost say the UFW helped nurture a whole generation of activists.
It's like they planted seeds that grew into something much bigger.
Exactly. And it shows how much influence the UFW really had, even as their own power started to fade later on. But to understand how that happened, we got to look at what came next.
All right, well, lead the way. I'm ready for part 2. So we've seen how the UFW rose up, all the smart moves they made, those big wins, but you hinted that it wasn't always smooth sailing. What kind of roadblocks did they hit?
Yeah, the 80s were tough. The UFW's influence, it started to fade. One big thing was, well, technology, really.
Oh, yeah.
Agriculture was becoming more mechanized, more machines, less need for workers. It's something a lot of labor movements have to deal with.
Right, so it's like they're fighting for better conditions, but the jobs themselves are changing.
Exactly. And on top of that, you had this influx of undocumented laborers. These folks, they were often desperate for any kind of work, scared of being deported, and the growers, well, they took advantage of that.
I can see how that would make it harder for the UFW.
Yeah, it did. They were trying to advocate for these vulnerable workers, but also trying to protect the union. It's a tough balancing act.
It sounds like a lot to deal with, the economy shifting, a different workforce, powerful growers pushing back at every turn.
Yeah.
How did the UFW even handle all that?
They tried to adapt, shifted their focus to things like pesticide exposure, pushing for immigration reform, things like that. But the whole landscape had changed.
Yeah.
The growers, they had money, they had political connections, and they weren't afraid to use them. They challenged union elections, they ran these aggressive anti-union campaigns, and sometimes it got downright nasty intimidation tactics, that sort of thing.
It really does sound like that David and Goliath situation, but maybe Goliath's got like a whole army now.
Yeah, something like that. And, it makes you think about what was going on within the UFW at the time. We talked about Chavez's leadership, but there were definitely some criticisms that came up.
Right, right. Can you expand on that a bit? What were people saying?
As things got tougher, some people started to question Chavez's style, specifically how he, centralized power. He was a brilliant strategist, no doubt, totally committed to the cause. But some folks, some historians especially, they've argued that his approach ended up shutting down dissent. Like Matt Garcia, he's one of them. He suggests that maybe if Chavez had been more inclusive, more willing to share leadership, the UFW might have been able to roll with the punches a bit better.
It makes you think, even with the best intentions, even the best leaders, they can have blind spots. And sometimes you got to change things up when the situation changes. It's that balance between strong leadership and making sure everyone's voice is heard.
You got it. And that's why it's so important to look at the UFW's journey through different historical lenses.
Okay, I'm ready for a history lesson. Lay it on me.
All right, so you've got historians like Kerry McWilliams. He's more of a traditional progressive. He saw the UFW as heroes, shining a light on how badly farm workers were being treated, fighting for basic rights.
So for him, it's about the UFW taking on a system that was really messed up. Who else is out there?
Then you've got Vicky Ruiz. She's a social historian. She digs into the grassroots activism, how regular folks were involved, especially women like Dolores Huerta.
Right.
Her work shows us those everyday heroes, the people who made things happen, not just the big names.
It's amazing how each historian kind of brings a different piece to the puzzle.
Absolutely. And then there's Matt Garcia, the one I mentioned before. He's more of a revisionist, takes a critical look at Chavez's leadership.
Right.
He says, yeah, Chavez did great things, but his control, it might have actually hurt the UFW in the long run. It makes you think about checks and balances, even within a movement that's trying to do good.
I like that. It's like, even with good intentions, you need to keep things in check.
Right. And then you've got Juan Gonzalez. He looks at things from a post-colonial perspective. Basically, he sees the UFW's fight as part of a much bigger picture. U.S.-Latin American relations, the legacy of colonialism, all those power imbalances. He's saying that the UFW was up against something much deeper than just bad working conditions.
Right. It's like those systemic issues, those things that have been baked in for generations.
Exactly. And when you look at it through all these different lenses, it gets complicated, But to really get the human side of the story, we got to turn to those primary sources. They bring things to life.
Yes. Let's crack open those archives. What kind of treasures did you find?
Oh, we've got a good mix. First up, that Time magazine cover from '69.
Ah, the iconic one.
Chavez on the cover of a major magazine on Independence Day, no less. It shows you how much attention the UFW was getting. Images like that, they have a real impact on how people see things.
It's like a snapshot of that moment when the UFW's message it really broke through.
It is. And then we've got all these original UFW campaign materials, flyers, posters, speeches, photos from the boycotts. It's really cool how they used cultural pride as part of their activism.
What do you mean?
Like they used Aztec imagery, Catholic symbols, stuff like that. It resonated with their community, it created this feeling of unity.
So it's like they're reclaiming their heritage, making it part of the fight.
Exactly. And finally, we've got some of Chavez's speeches. Powerful stuff. There's this one quote that always gets me. The fight is never about grapes or lettuce. It is always about people.
Man, that's powerful.
Sure.
It really sums up what they were all about. It wasn't just about money. It was about basic human dignity, respect for people who had been silenced for way too long.
You got it. And those words, they helped bring people together, turned a local fight into something much, much bigger. When you put all these primary sources together, you really get a sense of who the UFW was, what they were up against, how much they believed in what they were doing.
It really paints a picture. Those primary sources, they give us a glimpse into the heart of the UFW. And their struggle, it really shaped Chavez's legacy. So let's talk about how the UFW and Chavez's vision are still relevant today.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that even though the UFW's power as a union went down, their impact on social justice movements as a whole, well, that's huge.
In what way?
They inspired so many activists, they came up with innovative ways to resist peacefully, and they forced the country to see just how badly farm workers were being treated.
It's like those seeds they planted, they're still growing today in all these different movements.
Exactly. And Chavez himself, he became this symbol of fighting for what's right, never giving up, even when things are stacked against you. He showed that when people come together, they can achieve incredible things.
It's a powerful story. But I'm curious, we focus a lot on the heroic side of Chavez, but were there things about him, about how he led, that maybe played a part in the UFW's decline?
That's a good question, and one that historians have gone back and forth on. Chavez, he had this charisma, this dedication, no doubt, but some argue that his need for control, his reluctance to let others take the reins, it might have held the UFW back.
So maybe they weren't as flexible as they could have been when things started to change.
Maybe. It shows that even the most iconic figures, they're complicated. And it's by wrestling with those complexities that we get a better understanding of history.
Right. So looking back at the UFW, what are some lessons we can learn that might be useful for social justice movements today?
One big one is strategic nonviolence. The UFW proved that you can challenge the big guys, you can win big victories without using violence, even when people were fighting back against them. Sticking to peaceful resistance, even when it's tough, it earns you respect, it gets people on your side.
So it's not about being weak, it's about having the strength to stick to your principles.
Absolutely. And the boycotts, they were masters of that.
Yeah.
They really understood how to use consumer power, how to hold companies accountable, how to make them do the right thing. And that's still a powerful tool today.
They really made it personal, didn't they?
Yeah.
Like they helped people see the real people behind the products, the human cost.
Their message, it was simple but powerful. It really hit home for people, brought them together no matter where they came from.
So it wasn't just about fairness. It was about empathy, about seeing those farm workers as real people deserving of respect.
You got it. That human connection, it was key. Now, we've talked a lot about the UFW's struggles with the outside world, but they had their own internal challenges too. Did those play a part in how things went down?
Right. Internal stuff can be just as important as external. What were some of the issues they were dealing with?
Well, like we said before, Chavez's leadership, it was great at first, but as things got tougher, it started to cause problems. That whole centralization of power, not being willing to let go, it could have stifled things, stopped people from coming up with new ideas.
I guess it goes to show that even the most successful groups need to take a step back sometimes, look at themselves, see if they need to change things up.
For sure. The UFW's experience teaches us how important it is to have open communication, to let people disagree respectfully, and to share leadership.
So it's not just about one strong leader. It's about having a system where everyone can contribute right.
That's it. And I think that's something that applies to all kinds of groups, not just social movements.
I can see that.
Businesses, families, you name it. And one last thing about the UFW that's important to remember. They really understood that everything's connected. They didn't just focus on farm workers' rights. They saw how that was tied in with racial justice, economic inequality, immigration issues.
Right, so they were thinking bigger picture, not just one issue at a time.
Exactly. They were way ahead of their time with that. And that's something we still need to think about today.
It's incredible how the UFW's story is still so relevant today. But as we wrap things up, I want to go back to something we talked about before. The people, the individuals, the ones who really made this movement happen. It's easy to forget about them when you're focused on the big picture, isn't it?
It really is. We tend to remember the leaders, the famous names, but the UFW, they wouldn't have achieved anything without all those individuals, the farm workers who risked everything, the organizers who faced, threats and harassment, the volunteers who poured their heart and soul into it. Their stories, they're incredible. They show you what people are capable of when they believe in something.
It's really humbling when you think about it, isn't it?
Yeah.
Leaving their families, working in those tough conditions, constantly being pushed back. Also, they could create a better future, not just for themselves, but for their kids, for generations to come. What do you think drove them?
It's a good question. I think for a lot of them, it was just sheer desperation. They knew things had to change, the way they were living. It just wasn't sustainable. They were fighting for their basic dignity, to be treated like human beings.
Yeah. It reminds you that change doesn't come easy. It takes people willing to sacrifice, to put it all on the line for something bigger than themselves.
Absolutely. And a lot of those sacrifices, they went unnoticed, their names forgotten. But without them, the UFW wouldn't have won those victories. So as we look back at the UFW, what lessons can we take away? Things that maybe apply to social justice movements today?
That's what I'm wondering. Are there any parallels, any strategies that could still work today?
I think one of the biggest takeaways is that commitment to nonviolence. The UFW showed that you can take on powerful forces, you can achieve amazing things without resorting to violence, even when others are using violence against you. That dedication to peaceful resistance, it gave them moral authority, it got people on their side, and it worked.
It's like you don't have to be aggressive to be strong. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stand your ground peacefully.
Right, and the boycotts, they were so good at that. They knew how to hit where it hurt, how to use consumer power to force companies to change their ways.
And that's still relevant today, right?
Yeah.
We see boycotts happening all the time for different causes.
All the time. They understood how to make those connections, show people, the real people behind the products they were buying.
It was more than just about being fair. It was about appealing to people's emotions, helping them see those farm workers as human beings, deserving of respect.
Exactly. And that human connection, that empathy, it was powerful.
We've talked a lot about the UFW's battles with the outside world, but they had their own internal issues too, right? How did those affect their journey?
Oh, definitely. Like we talked about Chavez's leadership style, it had its downsides. That tight control, that unwillingness to let go of power, some say that it stifled them, held them back from growing and adapting.
So even when a group is successful, it's important to check in, see if things are working, be open to changing things up.
Exactly. The UFW story shows how important it is to encourage open communication, healthy disagreements, and shared leadership.
So it's not just about having one strong leader. It's about creating a structure where everyone has a voice. Everyone can contribute.
Exactly. And that's a good lesson for any organization, really. But one last thing about the UFW that I think is important. They understood that all these issues, they're connected.
What do you mean?
They didn't just fight for farm workers' rights in isolation. They saw how it was all tied together with racial justice, with economic inequality, with immigration. They were thinking about the bigger picture.
Right. So it wasn't just about one issue. It was about creating a fairer system for everyone.
That's it. And that's something we can all learn from today. We need to look at how these problems intersect, how they affect each other.
Well, this deep dive has been incredible. We've learned so much about the UFW, their wins, their losses, their challenges, their legacy. As we wrap things up, what's the one thing you hope people will take away from this?
I think it's that message of hope, that reminder that ordinary people can do extraordinary things. The UFW, they faced so many obstacles, but their belief, their strategy, it helped them achieve amazing things. They showed us that collective action, it can really make a difference. And their legacy, it inspires us to keep fighting for a better world, a world where everyone is treated with dignity and respect.
I love that. And on that note, We'll wrap up this deep dive. But the exploration doesn't have to end here. We encourage you to learn more about the people who made this movement happen, to study their tactics, and to think about how their experience can guide us as we work towards a more just world. Keep learning, keep questioning, and never stop fighting for what you believe in. Until next time.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.